people like Tulsi Gabbard come on the show and talk about how we shouldn't send in aid to places like Venezuela and we shouldn't do anything, I think that is absolutely also inhumane and heartless and anti-American.
Yes, but this is...
I do believe at this point...
Venezuelans and putting sanctions, economic and sanctions. Why are you so against intervention in Venezuela? Not military intervention, but what we are doing.
Because every time the United States, and particularly in Latin America, has gotten involved in regime change, using different tools to enact that regime change, there have been both short and long-term devastating impacts. If there are ways that we can work with surrounding countries to try to get humanitarian aid into people there, then we should be doing that. But for the United States to go in and choose who should be the leader of Venezuela, that is not something that serves the interests of the Venezuelan people. That's something that they need to determine themselves.
But the U.S. is not choosing who's going.
You know, we are hearing stories every day about the challenges and the suffering that the Venezuelan people are going through. The United States should not be intervening in what is happening in Venezuela. Only the Venezuelan people can be the ones to determine who their leader should be and the path forward for themselves and for their country. The problem with much of the humanitarian aid that has been delivered or is going into Venezuela is that it is being weaponized in this political war and being used as leverage in regime change there. If there's a way for the United States to be able to provide humanitarian aid by a neutral party who is not only giving that aid to one side or the other, but is actually helping everyone, then sure, we should provide that. The United States has a disastrous history of military intervention and regime change around the world, which has brought suffering to millions of people. It's bankrupted our country, dishonored our troops, and it's undermined our national security. We must end this policy now before we get into yet another military conflict, this time in Venezuela. Now, President Trump and his administration have already instituted heavy sanctions on Venezuela. They've doubled down on their position that all options are on the table. I wholeheartedly support the Venezuelan people as they fight for a free and fair democracy. But the United States should not be in the business of intervening, of picking who should lead their country, and we certainly should not be threatening military action. Venezuela poses no threat to the United States. Congress has not authorized the United States to go to war in Venezuela, and there's no justification for our country to violate the sovereignty of the Venezuelan people. Now, the reality is that threats of U.S. military action and regime change in Venezuela is undermining ongoing efforts to convince North Korea to give up their nuclear weapons program, which exists because Kim Jong-un sees it as the only deterrent against U.S.-led regime change. Now, President Trump is promising North Korea we will not wage regime change war against them, but at the same time is simultaneously threatening regime change in Venezuela. North Korea is going to look at President Trump's actions, not at empty promises. The United States needs to stay out of Venezuela and let the Venezuelan people determine their own future.
Here now exclusively, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii, a combat veteran and 2020 Democratic presidential candidate. You know, what's your reaction to that? You heard Kellyanne Conway, counselor to the president there.
What we are hearing is an increased saber-rattling intention saying the United States needs to send in the U.S. military now to wage yet another wasteful, counterproductive regime change war. And once again, it's being done under the guise of humanitarianism. When we look throughout history, every time the United States goes into another country and topples a dictator or topples a government, the outcome has been disastrous for the people in these countries. That's why we should use our leadership in the world to try to broker a diplomatic solution
working with countries like Russia that have great influence over Venezuela so that there is a peaceful outcome, because I can tell you as a soldier, Martha, I've seen firsthand the high cost of war, and pushing for this civil war, pushing for the use of military force will only end up with more suffering and death and disaster for the Venezuelan people. What to speak of increasing these tensions that threaten our own national security. Anytime we're in this situation where you have tensions being ratcheted up and this conflict being pushed closer and closer between nuclear armed countries like the United States and countries like Russia and China, this is something that poses an existential threat to the American people.
Okay, an interview, by the way, on CNBC today, Vice President Mike Pence said that embattled Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro must go.
Well, over the past 6 years, the people of Venezuela have been suffering through deprivation and the dictatorship of Nicolas Maduro. From the early days of this administration, President Trump has made it clear Nicolas Maduro has no legitimate claim to power, and Nicolas Maduro must go.
I wonder about the neocons, if they're coming back, Congresswoman, and whether they see an opportunity in Latin America. You hear the vice president, they're saying everything's on the table, military action, everything. The thought of the United States Army going into Venezuela, what do you make of it?
Yeah, look, this administration and the neocon war hawks that surround President Trump have made no secret about what their intentions are to further this regime change effort, both in Venezuela as well as in Iran. So we're hearing these war drums beating. President Trump is acting not with our interests in mind, not with the American people's interest in mind, and moving forward with something that will prove to be very, very costly.
Well, how did a guy... I'm sorry, I'm interrupting. I don't want to interrupt so much as I always do, but I want to ask you this question. I'm so hot to trot on this one. How can a president who ran against stupid wars, and I loved it when Trump said that, I'm against stupid wars, hire John Bolton, Sheldon Adelson's guy, his pick, and why did he bring Elliot Abrams back in on Latin America? I mean, what's going on? He brought the Neos in to do their old stuff again. How do you explain that switch?
That's a great question. We do have a situation with a cabinet full of neocon war hawks whose history is very well known in leading our country into one regime change war after the other, and to great expense in American lives, to trillions of dollars coming out of our taxpayers' pockets, as well as the lives and the suffering and the devastation of the people in the countries where we've waged these wars.
People like Tulsi Gabbard come on the show and talk about how we shouldn't send in aid to places like Venezuela and we shouldn't do anything. I think that is absolutely also inhumane and heartless and anti-American.
Yes, but this is